There is one mystery more intimate than the stars above, your own awareness. Philosophers called it the soul. Scientists call it the hard problem. Yet no single definition survives every debate. Consciousness feels immediate, closer than breath, yet slips through every explanation. But what happens when the theories collide? Is the mind just a machine, a spotlight on information, a network weaving complexity into something more? Or does awareness stretch even deeper, to animals, to AI, even to the universe itself? From neurons firing predictions in silence, to ancient meditations seeing awareness as ultimate reality, every culture and every lab has offered its own map, none complete, all fascinating. Tonight at NeuroNap Academy, we will discover all consciousness theories explained in 101 relaxing facts. Let's begin without ornament, just clarity and calm momentum. You're here to collect precise ideas that point toward the mystery we call consciousness, carried one after another like stones across a river. We will move fact by fact, linked with gentle transitions, so your understanding grows without strain, and we'll keep an eye on the deeper questions each fact awakens, because knowledge matters more when it connects to the life you're living right now. This is our first big fact. Many researchers call consciousness the hard problem, because explaining how physical processes in a brain could ever produce the felt texture of experience remains stubbornly unresolved. You can measure firing patterns, map networks, and predict behaviors, yet the glow of what it is like to taste, hurt, notice, or care doesn't appear on the instruments. That gap between objective description and subjective feeling is the heart of the difficulty, and it refuses to shrink just because the dataset grows. Why does this matter to you? Because it reframes everyday moments. When you notice a memory surfacing uninvited, you aren't just recalling, you are encountering the unsolved link between tissue and feeling. You live at that junction. Scientists can explain how signals move, but why there is something it is like to be you during those signals remains the open door. And in that openness, humility becomes a scientific attitude, not just a spiritual one. Before we go further, here comes a second clear stepping stone. There is no single, universally accepted definition of consciousness. Some definitions highlight wakefulness, others emphasize awareness, self-reference, reportability, or integration of information. Each captures a portion and misses another. This lack of consensus isn't sloppiness, it reflects the way the phenomenon spreads across attention, memory, selfhood, emotion, and perception. Define it too narrowly, and you lose its richness, too broadly, and it dissolves into vagueness. You can feel the practical consequence of this every time debates cross disciplines. A philosopher may use consciousness to mean raw experience, while a neuroscientist means access to globally available information, and a clinician means responsiveness in a hospital bed. They talk past one another without intending to, so when you hear bold claims, "We've solved it, we've disproved it," notice the hidden definition inside. Often the victory depends on the definition chosen at the start. Let's keep the momentum with a third grounding point. The mind-matter tension is ancient. Long before laboratories, thinkers wrestled with whether awareness is independent of the body or inseparable from it. Some argued for a separate, non-physical principle, others for a seamless continuity between living tissue and mental life. Across cultures, the pendulum swings, sometimes toward a soul-like essence, sometimes toward matter arranging itself into systems that feel. You stand in a long corridor of arguments, not at its end. This historical breadth offers something useful. It reminds you that your private intuitions, perhaps that you are more than your body, or perhaps that you are entirely biological, have appeared countless times in different clothing. Seeing that pattern softens certainty. Instead of assuming your first impression is final, you can ask what made people confident in the opposite view, and what evidence shifted them. That question turns belief into inquiry. Now a fourth steadying fact. Consciousness feels immediate and undeniable from the inside, yet proves elusive from the outside. You cannot doubt that you are experiencing. You can easily doubt what the experience reveals. Introspection grants certainty of presence, not explanation of origin. Meanwhile, external measurement grants detailed maps without direct access to the glow itself. Between those stances, inner certainty, outer description, most research strategies take shape. This is why methods split. Some approaches try to correlate specific patterns with reported experiences, building bridges between the first person and the third person. Others try to explain why the first person should be taken as a useful fiction, a convenient summary the brain produces for coordination. In daily life, you take both stances without noticing. You trust your feelings when they track reality. You question them when they mislead. Science reproduces that dance with more rigor. And now a fifth, quietly provocative point to carry forward. A minority of scholars argue that consciousness, as people usually talk about it, may be impossible to study directly, or even may be an illusion created by systems that only approximate what they claim. On this view, our language about inner light mistakes a complex set of information processing tricks for a unified thing. If that is right, the task isn't finding the glow, it's explaining why the brain insists on reporting one. Whether you agree or not, this challenge improves the conversation. It forces questions about evidence. What would count as a successful explanation? Is it enough to model report and behavior, or must a theory account for the felt quality as such? If feelings are just functions, then reproducing the functions should satisfy us. If feelings are more than functions, then no purely behavioral model will ever feel convincing, no matter how predictive it becomes. Between these poles, mystery elevated beyond measurement and illusion dissolved into mechanism, most contemporary theories chart a middle course. They propose specific operations that could support experience, then testable predictions that link those operations to reports, behaviors, and brain activity. These proposals differ in where they locate the key, in competition among processes, in integration across networks, in predictive loops, in higher order monitoring, or in the body's embedding of the brain. Each shines a light from a different angle. For your purposes, the most helpful stance is provisional. Hold any single model lightly, but take its testable consequences seriously. When a theory predicts that certain tasks should disrupt reportable experience and experiments confirm it, your picture sharpens, even if it isn't complete. When a model fails to anticipate a result, you refine it or move on. Progress here is less like unlocking a door and more like drawing a more accurate coastline with each tide. Notice what these 5 facts have already changed. You began with a problem framed as uniquely hard. You learned that even defining the target is contested. You saw that the argument predates the instruments we use. You felt the tension between inner certainty and outer evidence, and you entertained the possibility that the phenomenon you are chasing might be partly a trick of organization. Each step makes your curiosity more precise, which is the same as making it calmer. And you may feel an emerging question. If some describe consciousness as a special glow, and others as a set of operations, is there a way to talk about minds that honors both the felt and the functional, without slipping into poetry or denial? The next ideas try to do exactly that, not by retreating to abstractions, but by proposing concrete architectures that could carry the weight of experience without invoking magic. So we turn gently to a theory that imagines the mind as a stage with a moving spotlight. Certain contents are lit up so that many processes can access them at once, while the rest remain in the wings, active but unseen. It is a simple picture with ambitious reach, and it sets a standard for how a theory can be both intuitive and testable. If a spotlight truly explains awareness, we should be able to track when it widens, narrows, and shifts, and see experience change with it. In other words, we are ready for our next set of facts. We've placed 5 anchors in clear water. Now we'll ask how the brain might build a global arena where signals compete for entry, and why only a few win the right to be you at any moment. The stage is built from biology, but the performance feels personal. That paradox is where the next section begins. You're ready to follow a lineage of ideas that treats the mind not as a mist, but as a system, something that can be modeled, probed, and engineered. We'll keep the pace steady and the links tight, because what matters here is how one metaphor after another shaped what scientists tried to measure. Each step will add a piece to your internal map, and each transition will hint at what this map leaves out so you can feel where the next question rises. Here's our 6th solid fact. The modern debate about mind as machine takes off in a world still framed by Descartes' dualism, the claim that thinking stuff and extended stuff are distinct kinds of being. In that picture, your conscious experience belongs to a non-physical domain, while your body runs like precise clockwork. Descartes even suggested a small structure in the brain as the interface, a speculative hinge where immaterial and material might meet. Whether that hinge exists or not, the split influenced everything that followed. What that separation purchased was freedom to study bodies, mechanistically without denying experience. You could dissect, measure, and model tissue like gears and levers, then leave awareness to philosophy or theology. The result was a methodological bargain, let the body be a machine for the sake of explanation, and bracket the mystery of subjectivity for another day. You still live with the after effects of that bargain. Every time a scan reduces fear to activity patterns while your feeling remains more than those patterns. Flowing into a seventh anchoring fact, Thomas Hobbes pushed in the opposite direction, insisting that thinking itself is matter in motion. On this view, desires, beliefs, and choices are configurations and movements of physical parts. There is no extra ingredient. For Hobbes, the mind is not attached to a machine, it is the machine. The philosophical consequence is stark. If the mind is wholly physical, then in principle, a complete description of the motions should capture everything about experience. This looks clean until you ask what becomes of meaning and value. If thoughts are just motions, where do purposes live? The mechanist answers, in the organization of the motions. A plan is a pattern, a preference is a stable configuration that directs action. You already use this logic without noticing. When you say a thermostat wants to maintain a temperature, you're ascribing function to a system. The same move scaled up and made vastly richer underwrites the mechanistic mind. Let a new fact settle in. Our eighth. Across the 17th and 18th centuries, the living brain was often compared to hydraulic systems. Researchers talked about fluids and pressures, tiny pipes and valves, and animal spirits that inflated muscles like bladders. The metaphor was not random, it grew from the machinery people knew best. If the era builds fountains and pumps, then minds look like cleverly arranged flows. Under that picture, behavior becomes the managed release of force through channels. Hydraulic imagery did real work. It motivated experiments about reflexes, posture, and circulation. It suggested that control might be distributed rather than centralized. It pushed anatomists to trace routes rather than hunt a single throne. But the metaphor also constrained vision. If flow is your model, you underplay the role of symbols and codes. You see coordination as pressure, not as representation. The lesson generalizes. Technology teaches scientists how to imagine minds, and then minds return the favor by guiding the next machines. Now another clear fact takes its place, our ninth. The 19th century's dominant metaphor was the telegraph. Suddenly nerves were wires, impulses were signals, and the brain looked like a switching network. Timing and routing took center stage. Which path carries which message, how fast it travels, and what happens when two lines cross. With that shift came the first precise measurements of nerve conduction, the insight that speed varies by axon properties, and the intuition that communication patterns might explain perception and action. The telegraph metaphor deepened the idea of information in the nervous system. It also encouraged a picture of the brain as a message-passing hierarchy, with sensory stations feeding central relays that issued motor commands. That picture still lives in your language, input, processing, output. It can be illuminating and misleading. It neglects the chemical complexity at synapses, the plasticity that rewires routes during learning, and the loops where outputs become new inputs almost instantly. Even so, it gave researchers a grammar for talking about codes. And one more anchor for this chapter, our 10th fact. By the mid-20th century, the reigning analogy became the digital computer. The mind was modeled as an information processing system, algorithms, transforming inputs into outputs across memory registers with programs describing the rules. This move birthed cognitive science as a joint venture between psychology, neuroscience, linguistics, and computer science. Under this view, what matters is not the material a system is made of, but the functional organization that lets it compute. From there, two paths opened. One path, symbolic AI, treated thought as rule manipulation over discrete representations. The other, connectionism, treated thought as activity emerging from networks of simple units adjusting their strengths. You recognize both in today's landscape, logic-like models for planning and reasoning, and neural networks for perception and pattern discovery. The shared promise is functionalism. If a pattern of organization can be realized in silicon or carbon, then in principle, a machine might duplicate mental life. Here the philosophical stakes sharpen. If consciousness depends only on function, substrate independence follows. A machine that implements the right dynamics would feel. If instead, biology contributes something essential, electrochemical nuance, development, embodiment, then a perfect functional simulation could still be an empty shell. You can hear the echo of this question in your own intuitions. When you interact with a persuasive chatbot, does a part of you feel there's nobody home, or do you suspect that home is just what the right pattern would produce? Notice the pattern linking these facts. Each era's master technology, hydraulic pumps, telegraph networks, programmable computers, becomes a mirror the mind is held up to. The mirror is useful because it suggests hypotheses you can test, measure conduction velocities, map switching hubs, probe memory registers. The mirror is risky because you can mistake likeness for identity. The brain is not a computer in the familiar sense, any more than it is literally a telegraph switchboard, yet both analogies proved enormously fruitful. The practical discipline for you as a learner is to ask of any machine metaphor two questions. First, what measurable predictions does it make that rival pictures would not? Second, what phenomena does it ignore or dismiss that later turn out to matter? The telegraph predicted conduction delays and revealed bottlenecks. It dismissed plasticity. The digital metaphor predicted working and long-term stores. It often undervalued the body's role in shaping thought. When models evolve, it is the answers to those questions that push them. So where does this leave the glow of experience itself? Machine models describe flows, signals, and computations. They show how information is combined, broadcast, and used. They do not by themselves tell you why it feels like something to be the system doing the combining and broadcasting. Confronted with that gap, some researchers take a bold step. They claim the feeling is a useful construct the system generates, a narrative center that helps coordinate action, not a deep additional property. That claim opens the door to our next theme. If the self you report is a model built by the brain, then many puzzles about agency, unity, and even free will change shape. Instead of asking how an inner homunculus pilots the machine, you ask how a machine builds a convincing pilot and why the story helps it thrive. You are about to hear theories that say the self you defend is a moving target, powerful, coherent, and in crucial ways a controlled illusion. You've heard the claim that our machines shaped how we think about minds. Now we turn to the claim that the mind shapes a fiction about you. We'll keep it lean and linked, moving from proposal to implication without drama, because the point here is conceptual precision. What if the self you protect, defend, and narrate is not a thing discovered by the brain, but a model constructed by it for guidance? With that frame, let's place the next stepping stones carefully. Here is our 11th clear fact. Many neuroscientists and philosophers contend that the self you feel, stable, unified, continuous, is a controlled hallucination, not hallucination as error, but hallucination as useful construction, a compact summary that hides the messy parallel and partial processes actually running underneath. In other words, experience serves you a polished dashboard with one driver icon in the middle, so you can steer without drowning in low-level detail. You are shown you, because a system that feels owned and centered coordinates better than one that feels scattered. Now let a 12th anchor slide into place. Daniel Dennett's multiple drafts model denies a single inner theater where a homunculus watches finished scenes. Instead, the brain hosts many content streams in parallel, interpretations, sensations, fragments, edited and re-edited as they circulate. Some drafts gain influence by being recruited into speech, memory, and action. Others fade. There is no final editor, only competition and revision. What you call a conscious moment is whatever content wins enough time and channels to matter. This picture does two things for you. First, it removes the hidden observer that theories sometimes smuggle in when they try to explain awareness. There is no little you inside watching the big you. Second, it ties the feeling of a unified present to actual work the system does, distributing content wide enough, long enough for coordination. When you recall an event, you're not retrieving a file so much as you are restitching a draft that once won the race and now wins again, slightly altered by the retelling. We can deepen the contour with a 13th fact. Thomas Metzinger's self-model theory says the brain builds an internal, transparent model of the organism as a whole, its body, its position, its goals, its likely future states, and then crucially does not represent that model as a model, it presents it as reality. Because the model is transparent, you look through it rather than at it. You feel I, not my brain's current self-model. The advantage is speed and stability. Decisions can be made in reference to a single center that feels immediately present. This view illuminates everyday oddities. When your stomach flips and you suddenly just know you're anxious, you're watching the self-model integrate interoception into a narrative about threat and priority. When you feel ownership over a rubber hand in the classic illusion, the model stretches bodily boundaries to maintain coherence with visual evidence. When you become absorbed in a task and the sense of me quiets, The model is backgrounded while task-relevant drafts take the foreground. The I comes and goes because it is a tool, not a substance. Let's introduce the next sturdy piece, our 14th fact, by making it explicit on illusion and self-model accounts. The brain constructs a virtual self to control action. The self-model compresses posture, preferences, memories, skills, and social roles into a single interface. That interface predicts the consequences of moves, negotiates conflicts between drives, and streamlines planning. In that sense, the self is software for agency. It points the whole organism, resolves ambiguity fast enough for survival, and allows social partners to treat you as one reliable entity. Notice how this reframes vulnerability. When the model updates too slowly, you feel stuck. When it updates too fast, you feel unstable. Trauma can narrow it. Contemplative practice can soften it. Psychedelics can briefly dissolve it. None of that implies the model is fake in a dismissive way. It implies the model is adaptive, tunable, and sometimes brittle. You can respect its function and still question its claims to permanence. Now the 15th step, and it's a provocative one. If the self is a constructed interface, what becomes of free will? Illusion-centered theories argue that the felt authorship over actions, the sense that I could have done otherwise in that very moment, is part of the model's narrative function. It keeps behavior coherent across time by attributing decisions to a single center. This does not mean actions are random or meaningless. It means that the stories your system tells about why an action happened are after-the-fact justifications stitched to keep the interface stable and socially legible. You can see the benefit and the cost. The benefit is accountability. A community of agents coordinates better when each believes and asserts authorship. The cost is confusion. You may mistake narrative neatness for causal depth and ignore the layered influences genetics, learning history, context, unconscious competition that shape the draft that won. A kinder view of yourself and others follows when you remember that choice is real, at the level of systems steering in a world of constraints, even if ultimate authorship is not what it feels like. Here, a practical question rises for you. If the self is model and narrative, can you train it? Yes, by changing inputs, altering routines, engaging in practices that systematically shift what gets drafted and broadcast. Therapy, meditation, deliberate skill building, and even sleep hygiene influence which patterns stabilize. You are not the ghost inside the machine. You are the machine learning to present a wiser ghost. That line isn't a paradox. It's a reminder that construction can be guided. You might worry that calling the self a construction empties life of meaning. It does the opposite. A constructed interface can still love, choose, create, and repair. It simply does so as part of a living system rather than as a detached essence. When you forgive, your model updates its predictions about safety and reciprocity. When you commit, it stabilizes priorities across time. When you learn, it reweights associations so the next draft wins faster. Meaning sits inside those updates, not outside them. There's another payoff: illusions can be measured. If the self is a model, disrupting or amplifying specific signals should alter its boundaries in predictable ways. Experiments do exactly this through sensory conflicts, body ownership manipulations, time perception shifts, and altered interoceptive cues, and observers report corresponding changes in meanness. Each result tightens the loop between theory and experience. The more precise the manipulation, the more precise the claim about which draft features contribute to the feeling of being a unified subject. Still, construction stories leave you with an ache. If there's no inner witness, why does experience feel lit from within? One reply is that lit from within is how globally accessible, high salience content feels from the inside of a complex controller. Another reply is methodological humility. Your felt glow remains the datum to be explained, not a mistake to be waved away. The illusion claim is not that feelings are unreal, it is that their presentation as property of a simple subject is strategically streamlined for action. And that brings us to a hinge. We need a way to talk about how some content becomes widely available, how certain drafts win the resources that make them feel like what it's like right now. We also need a way to test this in tasks, timing, and neurophysiology without sneaking a homunculus back in. Fortunately, there's a framework built exactly for this purpose, one that imagines not a single inner spectator, but a shifting arena where winning content gets broadcast to many specialists at once. So in the next step, you'll see how a theater without a viewer can explain why some signals break through, why attention matters yet is not the same as awareness, and why the story of you is compelling precisely when its words ride on globally shared content. The stage is not magical, the spotlight is not a soul, but the way the spotlight moves may be the most practical handle we have on experience that feels unified. That is where we turn now, with steady hands and open questions. You're ready for a framework that keeps the clarity of self as construction and replaces the inner witness with a practical architecture. We stay lean: proposals, consequences, predictions. The promise is simple: explain which contents become what it's like right now by showing how they win access to a common stage where many parts of the brain can work with them at once. Here is our 16th concrete fact. Bernard Baars introduced the global workspace theory, proposing that consciousness is not a place in the brain, but a functional hub, a workspace where information is broadcast to many specialized processes at the same time. Think of countless unconscious specialists doing narrow jobs in parallel. When one specialist's content gets globally available, it becomes the content of your conscious moment. The theory shifts attention from a mystical light to a distribution mechanism you can test, which leads naturally to our 17th steady fact. GWT's central image is a theater with a moving spotlight. What sits in the spotlight is accessible to the audience of specialists, memory systems, language planners, evaluators, motor programs, while the rest of the stage remains active but dim. You don't need a homunculus watching the show. You need a spotlight that determines what many systems can use at once. The feeling of presence tracks the breadth of access, not the existence of an inner seer. Carry forward an 18th clear fact. Only a subset of ongoing neural activity ever enters this workspace. Most processing, edge detection in vision, prediction of phonemes, posture control happens without the broadcast. When a pattern's salience, coherence, or relevance crosses a threshold, it ignites global availability. When it falls short, it remains local and silent from your point of view. This explains why a sudden sound can pop into awareness, or a solution can surface after quiet simmering. Visibility follows entry to the broadcast, not mere existence in the system. Now let the 19th fact take its place. Unconscious processes compete for access to the global workspace. Multiple candidate contents, sensory interpretations, action plans, memories, goals are generated in parallel. Only a few win the right to be shared widely at any moment. Masking experiments, attentional blink, and rivalry paradigms all fit this picture. Stimuli can be processed deeply without report until they defeat competitors or the competition is eased by timing, attention, or expectation. Consciousness, on this view, is the victory condition of a neural contest. From here, a 20th practical fact follows with everyday consequences. Because the workspace can broadcast only so much at once, GWT explains why multitasking is sharply limited. When two tasks both demand global access, reading while composing a message, planning speech while solving an equation, performance collapses or alternates. You can run many unconscious routines in parallel, but only a narrow band can occupy the spotlight. This is why you lose the thread when a notification steals entry to the broadcast. The stage cannot host two centerpieces at the same time. You might ask how this theater looks in biology. Extensions of GWT, often called the global neuronal workspace, predict late, widespread ignition when a stimulus becomes reportable. Long-range synchronization, a characteristic surge of activity that binds distant regions into a temporary coalition. In simpler terms, conscious access should light up a broad network rather than just a local patch. Experiments align with that expectation in many tasks. Weak stimuli that remain invisible elicit early local responses. Strong or attended stimuli recruit distributed, longer-lasting patterns consistent with broadcast. This architecture also clarifies the difference between attention and awareness without splitting them entirely. Attention in top-down or bottom-up forms acts like a control knob that biases the competition for entry. You can attend to something without it becoming fully conscious if the competition is fierce or the signal too weak. Conversely, salient events can crash into awareness with little deliberate attention. The stage metaphor handles the nuance. Attention steers the spotlight, but entry still depends on the race among candidates. Philosophically, the payoff is restraint and reach. Restraint, because the theory does not claim to explain why the broadcast feels like something. It explains what consciousness does for the system, makes selected information globally usable for flexible, reportable, deliberate control. Reach, because that function predicts measurable signatures, improved cross-modal coordination, wider memory embedding, and the capacity to integrate a content into reasoning and language. Where those signatures appear, the theory says, conscious access likely occurred. The model also reframes inner conflict in practical terms. When you say you're of two minds, you are describing simultaneous candidates vying for broadcast, urge versus plan, habit versus value. Training, therapy, and context shift the biases that determine which contender wins the stage. You don't need to imagine a single sovereign will fighting sub-agents. You can picture a tournament whose rules you can gradually alter by changing sleep, stress, cues, and skills, so better contenders win more often. Critics press the open question, does broadcast cause experience, or merely accompany it? The honest answer inside the theory is functional. If broadcast is neither necessary nor sufficient, the account must be refined. Supporters reply with dissociations. When contents are globally shared, they become reportable, recallable, and usable in reasoning. When they are not, they rarely are. Whether one takes that as identity or correlation, the pattern is empirically rich enough to guide new tests rather than closing debate. The theatre picture also scales to development and expertise. As you acquire a skill, more of its control becomes local and automatic, demanding less time in the workspace. Expert performance feels smoother, partly because the spotlight is freed for strategy and monitoring. Conversely, when you learn something new, more steps require conscious access because they must be coordinated across many systems. The spotlight thus tracks novelty, difficulty, and risk. It shines where flexible integration is needed most. GWT further predicts that conscious moments are temporally extended. Contents need to persist long enough to be shared widely. This aligns with the intuition that the now you feel is a short window rather than an instant, and with data showing that awareness correlates with sustained, not merely instantaneous, activity patterns. The stage must hold the scene long enough for multiple specialists to take their turn with it. Flash-fast events that fail to persist rarely feel like what is happening to me right now. There is, finally, a graceful limit in the metaphor itself. A spotlight suggests selection and access, but says little about why some ensembles feel richer or more unified than others. If broadcast alone made experience, any sufficiently strong sharing would feel identical across contexts, yet you know from life that the grain of experience varies. This is where the next family of ideas steps in, shifting the emphasis from selection and access to the internal structure of the system that's doing the sharing. So we carry the gains from the theatre competition, broadcast, limited capacity, measurable signatures, into a new question: what if the depth of experience depends on how integrated and differentiated a system's activity is at a given moment? Instead of asking only which contents win the stage, we ask how tightly the stage is knit and how richly distinct its patterns can be. That pivot takes us from the metaphor of a spotlight to a metric, from access to architecture, and that is where we turn next. You've seen how a moving spotlight can explain access, coordination, and the narrow bandwidth of now. But some researchers ask a different question, not just which contents reach the stage, but how the stage itself is built. How tightly is it woven? How rich are the patterns it can sustain at once? If conscious moments feel unified yet detailed, perhaps that feeling mirrors an objective property of the system generating them. Here is our 21st clear fact. Giulio Tononi's Integrated Information Theory, IIT, proposes that consciousness is identical to a system's intrinsic cause-effect structure, the way its parts constrain one another here and now. In simple terms, experience is not what the system does for an outside observer, it is what the system is for itself, as a web of influences that cannot be reduced to independent pieces. The theory starts from phenomenology, unity, differentiation, specificity, and asks what kind of physical organization could match those features. To turn that into testable shape, IIT distinguishes two demands. First, differentiation. A conscious experience is highly informative, because it is one among many. Precise possibilities, this shade not that, this word not its neighbors. Second, integration. The experience is one, it cannot be split into separate, non-interacting parts without losing what it is. Put together, a rich conscious scene must be both many and one, massively specific yet indivisible. That philosophical starting point becomes a mathematical target, which brings us to our 20-second anchor. IIT quantifies this property with a measure called phi. Very loosely, phi estimates how much information is lost if you cut a system into parts and consider those parts in isolation. If severing the system barely changes its cause-effect power, phi is low. If cutting it destroys most of what the system could do to itself, phi is high. The minimum cut that damages this internal power, the weakest link, reveals how inseparable the whole really is. You don't need the equations to feel the intuition. Imagine two separate displays showing random pixels. Even if each is noisy, together they don't compose a single patterned image. Integration is poor. Now imagine a single display where each region's state tightly constrains others in lawful ways. Remove a swath, and the remaining pattern no longer has meaning. Integration is strong. Enlightenment says the second case carries more conscious presence, because the whole's internal causal web cannot be reconstructed from parts. Here then is our 23rd steady fact. On IIT, the more integrated and differentiated a system's internal structure, the more consciousness it has, and the richer its content. This is not about how useful the system is to us, nor about reports and behavior per se. It is about how deeply the system's present state makes a difference to its own possible pasts and futures. Proponents argue this maps onto observations that waking brains show widespread complex interactions, while dreamless deep sleep, certain anesthetics, and some seizures reduce or collapse that complexity. A practical implication follows. If fate tracks conscious level, then controlled disruptions that break long-range integration should dim or extinguish reportable experience. Conversely, perturbations that propagate widely and distinctively suggest a system ready for consciousness. This motivates tools that ping the cortex and watch how echoes spread, looking for signatures of integration rather than just local activation. The more the echo travels and differentiates, the more the fabric seems capable of holding a detailed, unified scene. Now let a fourth piece for this chapter take its place, our 24th fact. Because integration and differentiation admit degrees, IIT implies that even simple systems might possess a vanishingly small glimmer of experience if their parts constrain one another in minimal, irreducible ways. A humble circuit could in principle have a microscopic fat. A richly recurrent network could have a far larger one. In that graded picture, consciousness is not an on-off switch, but a spectrum tied to causal architecture. You can feel both the elegance and the unease in that move. Elegance, because the step from brain to experience becomes continuous. No mysterious threshold is required, only increasing integration and specificity. Unease, because the idea that a trivial device might host the faintest what it is like challenges common sense. The thermostat you joke about is not the target. Its integration is likely negligible, but the principle insists that substrate matters only insofar as it supports the right causal web, not because neurons are magic. That leads naturally to our 25th fact. IIT's graded, substrate-agnostic stance has panpsychist-like implications. It does not claim that everything thinks, but it does claim that wherever there is non-reducible cause-effect structure, there is, to that extent, experience. Critics say this explains too much, eroding the boundary that made the problem interesting. Defenders counter that the boundary was always a projection of our intuitions, and that a principal continuum is an advance, not a retreat. A few more features complete the picture. IIT includes an exclusion principle. Among overlapping candidate systems, the one with the maximal fat at a given spatio-temporal scale is the experiencing subject, that avoids absurdities where countless overlapping subsets would each host a separate mind. It also insists that the relevant structure is intrinsic, defined from the system's own causal powers, not an external label like function for an observer. In that way, IIT tries to honor the inside view without mysticism. There are honest tensions. Computing phase for large, realistic systems explodes combinatorially. Approximations are required. Empirical tests often use proxies for integration and differentiation rather than phase itself. Competing frameworks like Global Workspace explain many data about report and access without invoking intrinsic cause-effect structure. And philosophers press the identity claim. Even if phase correlates with level and richness, why should this much integrated information feel like this shimmering blue, this ache, this surge of recognition? Yet the theory's discipline keeps it in the game. It advances concrete predictions about the relative consciousness of different network topologies, about the effects of lesions that disconnect hubs, about the insufficiency of purely feed-forward architectures to carry experience. It chastens our metaphors. If we talk about broadcast, we should ask what is being broadcast within, what fabric makes the broadcast more than a loud but empty show, and it opens ethical questions. If consciousness maps to integration, what obligations do we have as we design ever more recurrent autonomous systems? For you personally, IIT offers a clarifying angle on daily fluctuations. When you feel foggy, scattered, or unusually unified and vivid, the theory would point to changes in how widely and distinctively your brain's activity patterns knit. Good sleep, focused attention, and balanced arousal can be read as conditions that support integration without rigidity, overload, sedation, and certain pathological synchronies can be read as forms of collapse, either too fragmented or too locked to carry many in one experience. It also reframes debates about evidence. If you require speech to certify consciousness, you'll miss patients whose integration remains but whose motor outputs are blocked. If you rely only on local spikes, you'll mistake rich fabrics for mere noise. The IIT lens says look for structured propagation, for patterns that cannot be factored into independent chunks, for holes that resist clean division. Where you find those, you have reason to expect a light is on, even when language is silent. Still, a single fabric cannot tell the whole story. Integration says how tightly the web is woven. It does not by itself explain why the web settles on these contents now. For that, you need to add dynamics of expectation and error, how a living brain constantly predicts the world and corrects itself when surprised. If IIT sketches what a conscious system must be like in structure, predictive processing sketches how such a system stays in touch with a changing world. So we carry forward a balanced picture. From the theatre, we keep access and competition. From IIT, we keep the demand that the stage be a single, richly differentiated fabric. Next, we'll ask how that fabric anticipates its inputs, updates its models, and sometimes mistakes its predictions for reality. In that story, hallucination is not a failure, but a starting point, and experience becomes the brain's best guess made vivid. Let's turn to the brain as a prediction engine. You've seen how a system's fabric can be tightly woven and richly differentiated. Now we ask how that fabric stays in register with a changing world. The proposal is spare and powerful. Your brain is not a passive camera, it is an active forecaster. It guesses what is out there and in here, then updates those guesses when the world pushes back. With that frame in mind, here is our 26th clear fact. The brain operates as a prediction machine, continuously anticipating incoming signals before they arrive. It sends top-down expectations through layered pathways and meets bottom-up evidence traveling upward. Where expectation and evidence agree, processing is cheap. Where they clash, the system pays attention. Surprise becomes fuel for learning. To keep this grounded, imagine the hierarchy at work. Higher levels predict broad, slow-changing causes, like the presence of a face or the layout of a room, while lower levels predict finer details, features, edges, textures, phonemes in speech. Each level sends a guess down and receives a different signal back. The aim is not to build a perfect inner copy of the world, it is to reduce error efficiently by tracking the hidden causes that matter for survival. You live in this economy of expectation. Every time you anticipate the next word of a sentence or reach for a cup without staring at your hand. Here's the next anchor, stated plainly. Your brain constantly generates models of reality, about the external scene, about your body's internal state, and about the social world. These are generative models. They don't just label what is seen, they simulate what should be sensed next if the hidden causes are as expected. Crucially, the system learns the precision of its models, how confident to be, so it can decide whether to trust a prior expectation or the new evidence arriving now. In noisier contexts, it leans on priors. In clear contexts, it lets evidence lead. Now let our 28th steady fact take the stage, perception. On this account is the process of minimizing prediction error. What you experience at any moment reflects the hypothesis that best explains away the flood of sensory data with the least residual mismatch. The math echoes Bayesian reasoning, priors. What usually happens combine with likelihoods, how reliable current input seems, to yield a posterior, your best current model. When the posterior is stable and low error, it feels like a crisp perception. When it is unstable, the scene feels ambiguous. This makes a familiar but radical claim easier to hold. Ordinary perception is a controlled hallucination. Your experience is the brain's best guess, constrained by sensory input and constant error correction. The controlled part matters. Unlike free-floating fantasy, your generative model is tethered to the world by the cost of getting it wrong. If you overpredict a step that isn't there, gravity corrects you. If you underpredict the rhythm of a sentence, comprehension stumbles and you repass. The feel of reality is the feel of predictions being honed by incoming facts. Here comes our 29th fact, with delicate implications for health and everyday life. Hallucinations emerge when predictions dominate evidence, when priors are weighted too strongly or evidence is treated as too noisy to correct them. In sensory deprivation, strong priors fill the gap. Under certain drugs, the usual precision balance is altered so that internally generated content gains undue influence. In some psychiatric conditions, high-level beliefs can resist disconfirmation, pulling perception and interpretation into their orbit. The framework doesn't trivialize these states. It explains how small shifts in weighting can have large experiential consequences. This idea also clarifies how attention fits in. Attention, in this view, is the flexible control of precision, the system's way of deciding which errors deserve resources. When you attend to a faint sound, you increase the expected reliability of auditory inputs, amplifying their errors so they can correct your model. When you daydream, you lower the precision of sensory channels and let top-down simulation run. Fatigue, stress, and arousal all tug on these dials, which is why a tired brain overreads shadows or a vigilant one jumps at harmless noises. Precision is the currency of experience. We can now phrase our 30th fact as a simple balance statement. Conscious content emerges where prediction and correction meet in a self-consistent model that wins the system's precision-weighted competition. Too much prior, and you drift into self-confirming fantasy. Too much error, and you drown in noise without stable content. The vividness you feel tracks not just the strength of a signal, but the confidence that the system has in its current explanation. When the model holds across sensory, bodily, and contextual channels, experience coheres. When it falters, you feel confusion, surprise, or awe. The body belongs inside this loop, not outside it. Your interoceptive system predicts heartbeats, breathing, hunger, and visceral states, and errors here inform feelings. Anxiety can be read as a model that overpredicts threat and misreads bodily noise as danger. Calm practice trains different priors and different precision settings, so the same thump in the chest no longer dominates the scene. Sleep, nutrition, and movement change the statistics of the incoming signals. Your predictions about yourself become kinder or harsher depending on what the body keeps telling the brain to expect. Philosophically, the picture is bracing and generous. You are not a detached observer peering out of a skull window. You are a living prediction engine, coupling to a world through action. You move to reduce error, turn your head, ask a question, rehearse a phrase, and your actions change the very inputs you will receive. Knowledge becomes an active loop. Perceive, act, confirm, correct. Responsibility still matters, because you can train the priors you live by, but it takes on a new flavor. Curiosity and compassion become technical virtues for better modeling. This also reframes conflict and growth. When a belief about yourself seems immovable, it may be carrying enormous prior weight, protecting you from uncertainty at the cost of accuracy. Therapy and learning work by safely lowering that weight, letting new evidence in. Meditation quiets the habitual predictions, long enough for subtle errors to be felt. Art and travel deliberately spike prediction error in controlled ways, expanding the repertoire of plausible models. Wisdom then is not certainty, it is flexible confidence calibrated to the world. Prediction alone, however, doesn't finish the picture. If the brain is always modeling, what explains the specifically reflective feel of being aware that I know quality that sometimes blooms? Why do some contents not only win the perceptual contest, but also become the very things you can think and speak about as your current state? To approach that, we turn to theories that add a new layer, thoughts that monitor other thoughts, models that include the fact that a model is active. The stage begins to notice itself. So we carry forward the lesson of balance between expectation and evidence, between inner and outer, between stability and surprise, into a viewpoint where awareness itself is modeled and reported. Up next are proposals that say a perception becomes conscious when the system represents it as its own, available to higher interpretive routines. In other words, prediction builds the scene. A different mechanism declares, "This scene is mine now." That is where we head, with the same calm attention to what each claim can genuinely explain. We've walked through the brain as spotlight and as prediction engine. Now we turn toward theories that add a second mirror, a reflective loop. They say what makes a perception conscious is not only that it is present in a model, but that the system also represents that it is representing. In other words, awareness comes from a thought about a thought. So here is our 31st fact, placed with care. Higher order thought theories propose that a mental state becomes conscious only when the brain generates another state that says, I am having this perception. A first order representation, say neurons signaling the color red, is not enough. It must be tagged or monitored by a second order thought, like I am seeing red. Without that meta level, the content remains unconscious, like countless patterns in the brain that guide behavior without surfacing. This gives a striking reframe. On hot HT theories, your inner life is not simply the glow of first-order sensations, it is the ongoing commentary the system adds about its own states. The chatter inside your head is not an accident, it may be the very substance of consciousness. If you imagine a camera filming a landscape, the raw footage exists, but only when someone narrates, I am filming the mountain, does that footage become part of a lived, reportable scene. Here comes our 32nd anchor. A first-order perception can exist without awareness. Experiments show that visual stimuli can guide behavior even when participants deny seeing them. The implication is that the raw representation edges, motion, color, can be active but unconscious. Only when a higher-order system tags it does it cross into the domain of subjective life. The difference between blind seeing and seeing may be nothing more than whether a meta-representation is in play. To make this concrete, think about the times you drive home lost in thought. Your body steers, brakes, and navigates, but you wake up with no memory of parts of the road. First-order representations did their job, guiding behavior. But without higher-order monitoring, they never became contents of experience. The awareness you recall is only of the moments when a hot took place. I am noticing the light, I am turning the wheel. The rest vanished, not because it failed, but because it lacked a watcher in thought. Here is our 33rd steady fact. Hot theories explain reflective self-awareness, the ability to say not just there is pain, but I know that I am in pain. This is a leap beyond sensation. It allows narrative planning and learning. It makes emotions communicable and choices deliberate. By layering meta-thoughts over raw states, the system turns brute experience into owned experience. The subjective I arises not because sensations are special, but because some sensations are tagged as belonging to me now. And now our 34th fact, which addresses the shadow side. Critics argue hot models explain too little. Why should tagging a representation with a higher order thought generate the felt glow of awareness? Couldn't the tagging happen unconsciously too? If all hot hat adds is monitoring, the problem of subjectivity remains. Defenders reply that the glow is what it is like to be a system monitoring itself. To be conscious is to carry both the content and the mark of ownership together, fused in one package. You can see how this framework intersects with daily life. Mindfulness practice, in which you notice thoughts as thoughts, can be seen as training the higher order system. I am aware of being aware. The reflective loop thickens. Meanwhile, distraction or dissociation can be seen as a break in the loop. Perceptions run but without higher order confirmation. Trauma may anchor hyper-vigilant meta-thoughts, flooding every perception with I am threatened. Growth can anchor more generous ones, softening I am flawed into I am aware of being critical now. The hot picture also reframes development. Young children may have rich first-order experience long before they can generate the meta-thoughts that tag them. Language expands the power of heights, making them explicit and shareable. That is why memory before language feels fragmentary. You had states but not the higher-order scaffolding to hold them as mine. Likewise, animals without advanced meta-representation may experience in narrower ways, or in ways we cannot translate. The theory invites humility. The line between aware and unaware may depend on meta-capacity, not raw sensation. This framework links tightly to brain anatomy. Prefrontal regions, often implicated in metacognition and error monitoring, are proposed as HOTOT generators. Damage there can leave perception intact, but insight into perception degraded. A person may act on information they deny having. Conversely, overactive meta-systems may generate false positives, feelings of seeing or hearing without input, as in hallucinations or delusions of control. The HOTOT stance gives a mechanistic reason for why awareness can be both absent in presence and present in absence. But we return to the philosophical itch. Even if HOTs explain reflective report, do they explain the raw what it is like? Some suggest that HOTs dissolve the mystery by redefining it. Consciousness just is being monitored. Others suggest they only push the problem up a level. Now we must explain why a higher order thought itself is conscious. The loop risks regress. Defenders answer that regress halts when a system monitors its own current state in a way that can guide action, leaving no inner witness but a reflexive pattern. Where does this leave you? With a lens for understanding your own inner narrative. Each time you label "I am anxious," "I am focused," "I am tired," you're not merely describing, you're instantiating a higher order tag that makes the state conscious and communicable. That's why naming emotions helps regulate them. The HOT stabilizes the state, making it shareable and manageable. Awareness is not only perception, it is perception narrated, confirmed, and owned by the system itself. Still, HOT say little about why some perceptions catch the tag and others don't. To answer that, we turn back to attention and competition. What guides the higher order system's choice of what to monitor? Why does one representation win reflection while another fades? Some answers point to attentional systems, which bias the contest. Others point to workspace dynamics, where widely available contents are likelier to be tagged. To follow this trail, we need to separate two often conflated ideas: attention and awareness. So we move calmly from the question of reflection to the question of selection. Attention is the brain's way of weighting inputs, but it does not always produce awareness. Awareness can arise without deliberate focus, and attention can operate without subjective glow. The next chapter explores that tension. It asks what it means to attend, what it means to be aware, and why the two sometimes overlap but are never identical. You've just seen how higher order thoughts may explain why some states feel like yours, as if tagged by a reflective narrator. Now we turn to a puzzle that runs alongside. The difference between attending to something and being aware of it. Many theories once assumed the two were the same, but experiments and experience reveal otherwise. To unfold this distinction, we'll place 4 facts carefully, each one clarifying how selection and awareness interact but never fully overlap. Here is our 35th fact. A starting point. Attention and consciousness are not identical. Attention is the brain's mechanism for selecting and amplifying certain signals, prioritizing them for processing and action. Consciousness is the felt presence of content in your awareness. They often travel together. You attend, and the attended object becomes vivid, but not always. You can attend without full awareness, and you can be aware of something without deliberate attention. The split matters because it shows that selection and presence are distinct operations. Think of a classic everyday case. You're focused intently on reading, attending with precision, when suddenly you realize you've been hearing music in the background all along. The music was part of your awareness, faint but real, without having been the target of your attention. Conversely, when you search for a friend in a crowd, you aim attention widely and sharply, but you may still fail to become aware of a figure who fits the description, because the signal doesn't break into conscious presence. Awareness and attention overlap like two circles in a Venn diagram, intersecting but not identical. That brings us to our 36th anchor. It is possible to attend without awareness, as shown by the phenomenon of blind sight. Patients with damage to visual cortex deny seeing anything in part of their field, yet when asked to guess about movement, orientation, or shape in that blind area, their performance is far above chance. Attention systems can steer responses to unseen stimuli, allocating resources and guiding action, without generating the subjective glow of "I see it." Here, attention works without consciousness. The blind sight case reveals that your nervous system can deploy selective resources in ways that escape awareness. You can orient, respond, even succeed in discrimination tasks, all without the felt "there it is." That distinction makes sense if attention is a filter and amplifier, while consciousness requires additional integration or tagging. In that model, attention raises the volume of a signal, but awareness requires that signal to be admitted into the workspace, or tagged by a higher order thought, or embedded in the predictive loop that grants ownership. Now let's set down our 37th fact. Awareness can exist without deliberate attention. This is most obvious in cases of pop-out perception. When a bright red dot appears among grey ones, you instantly become aware of it, even if you never decided to attend. Similarly, a sudden loud crash in a quiet room bursts into awareness before you aim attention at it. The content claims presence by virtue of its salience, not because you focused effort. Consciousness, in these moments, leaps ahead of attention. Everyday life provides subtler examples. Emotions, moods, and background sensations often rise into awareness uninvited. You become aware of a headache, a sense of unease, or a half-remembered tune without ever having chosen to focus on them. Attention may then follow, amplifying or suppressing, but the spark of awareness arrives first. This dissociation is vital. It shows that subjective presence is not just the byproduct of resource allocation. It emerges from processes that attention can shape but not fully control. Now a final step in this chapter, our 38th fact. Some theorists argue that attention is necessary for consciousness, while others insist it is not. The truth may be layered. Certain kinds of awareness, subtle, fleeting, background, may occur without focused attention, but stable, reportable, deliberate awareness likely depends on attention to stabilize and amplify content long enough for it to be remembered and acted upon. In that sense, attention is not identical to awareness, but it is a gatekeeper of lasting functional consciousness. This distinction has profound consequences for how you understand yourself. It means you are constantly aware of more than you attend to, a background hum of perception and feeling that escapes your narrative. It also means your attention can shape, distort, or neglect parts of reality without erasing their fleeting presence. You live inside a layered field, a wide awareness of which only a sliver receives attention, and an even narrower sliver becomes integrated into reportable memory. Philosophically, this division softens the myth of the spotlighted self. You are not a single beam scanning reality. You are a broad, rich awareness with a narrow, movable spotlight of attention. What you notice, act on, or recall depends on where the spotlight lands, but what you feel in passing may include more than you can ever narrate. The self is smaller than your awareness, and your awareness is smaller than the whole set of processes at work. This clarity leads directly to a new frontier. If awareness can arrive before attention, and attention can work without awareness, then neither suffices to explain the full glow of subjective life. Some researchers looked elsewhere toward physics, even quantum phenomena, to account for the stubborn residue. Could it be that awareness taps into processes deeper than neural competition or attentional bias, processes at the very edge of matter itself? That is the question we turn to next. You've seen how attention and awareness can pull apart like two dancers who sometimes move in sync and sometimes cross paths. From here, the story takes a more daring turn. Some thinkers have asked, what if the mystery of consciousness cannot be solved entirely within classical neuroscience? What if the answer requires looking into the foundations of physics itself, into the strange behavior of particles and probabilities? These are the so-called quantum theories of consciousness. They are controversial, imaginative, and deeply provocative. Let's step through them slowly, one fact at a time. Here is our 39th fact, the opening move. Roger Penrose, a mathematical physicist, proposed that consciousness cannot be explained by algorithms or computations alone. He argued that human understanding, especially in mathematics, sometimes transcends formal rules. To account for this, Penrose suggested that consciousness might rely on non-computable processes tied to quantum mechanics. In his view, the mystery of awareness pointed to mysteries in physics, specifically in the collapse of quantum states. Now, our 40th fact. Penrose drew on Gödel's incompleteness theorem as inspiration. He believed that because formal systems cannot prove all truths about themselves, and yet humans can sometimes see such truths, our minds must operate beyond computation. This leap linked logical puzzles to physical speculation. Maybe the brain accesses something non-algorithmic, and maybe quantum phenomena, indeterminacy and collapse are the bridge. Whether convincing or not, the argument lit a fire that still burns in debates about consciousness. Here is the 41st fact. Expanding the idea, anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff partnered with Penrose to propose the orchestrated objective reduction theory, often abbreviated ORCH or. According to this model, consciousness arises from quantum computations inside structures called microtubules within neurons. Microtubules are tiny scaffolding filaments, part of the cell's cytoskeleton. Hameroff suggested they could maintain quantum states long enough to influence brain activity, with orchestrated collapses producing conscious moments. This made the brain less a simple network of firing cells and more a quantum processor embedded in biology. Critics, however, have been sharp, which leads us to our 42nd fact. Many scientists argue the brain is far too warm, wet, and noisy to sustain delicate quantum states. Quantum coherence typically requires isolation and low temperatures. In the messy environment of a living brain, coherence should collapse almost instantly, long before it could influence neurons. This objection casts doubt on whether ORCH is feasible. For decades, this critique has been a central roadblock, leaving quantum consciousness in the margins of mainstream science. But here's our 43rd fact, softening the critique. Recent discoveries in biology show that quantum effects do appear in warm, wet systems. In photosynthesis, for example, energy transfer seems to exploit quantum coherence for efficiency. Similarly, in avian navigation, birds may sense Earth's magnetic field through quantum entanglement in their eyes. These examples do not prove quantum consciousness, but they do show that nature sometimes harnesses quantum phenomena even in messy biological conditions. The door, once thought firmly closed, remains cracked open. And now our 44th fact. Rounding out this chapter, despite its controversy, quantum mind theories continue to inspire because they point to a bigger theme, that consciousness may not be fully explained within neuroscience alone. Even if or is wrong, the suggestion pushes researchers to consider whether awareness is fundamental, perhaps woven into the very fabric of reality, alongside space, time, and energy. This echoes ancient intuitions that mind and cosmos are intertwined, though it dresses them in modern physics. Taken together, these 6 facts map a frontier. Quantum theories are not consensus science, but they remind you of a truth. The mystery of consciousness keeps pulling thinkers to the edges of what is known. When ordinary models feel insufficient, speculation spills into new domains. Sometimes these speculations fade, sometimes they plant seeds for discoveries decades later. Quantum mind theories live in that tension, part daring proposal, part scientific heresy, part imaginative mirror of how little we truly know. Philosophically, they challenge you to consider humility. If consciousness were linked to quantum processes, then awareness might not be something added late in evolution, but something tied to the universe's bedrock rules. That would mean the light inside you reflects the same strangeness that governs particles. Whether true or not, the suggestion stretches the imagination and keeps alive the question of whether mind is an emergent latecomer or a fundamental principle. But imagination has many directions. If one path looks to physics, another looks to metaphysics, suggesting not that the brain generates consciousness at all, but that consciousness pervades matter from the start. From electrons to ecosystems, some thinkers argue that mind is everywhere in seed form. That too has become a serious theory in contemporary debate. And so, from quantum physics, we pivot toward panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is woven through all things, not merely concentrated in brains. We've traveled through the daring landscape of quantum mind theories, where physics itself is invoked as a possible stage for awareness. Now, let's turn to an idea that is no less audacious but takes an entirely different path. Instead of saying consciousness arises only in complex brains or quantum processes, panpsychism suggests something startlingly simple. Perhaps mind is everywhere, in some form, woven into the very fabric of matter. Here is our 45th fact, the opening to this view. Panpsychism is the philosophical position that consciousness is a universal feature of reality, present even at the smallest scales of matter. It doesn't claim that electrons have thoughts or that atoms dream, but rather that they carry some rudimentary spark of experience, however primitive. On this model, human awareness is not a sudden miracle, but a flowering of a principle that runs through all things. This leads us to our 46th fact. Ancient traditions already hinted at versions of panpsychism. The Stoics, for example, described a world infused with pneuma, a vital breath or soul pervading everything. In Indian philosophies too, the universe was sometimes portrayed as consciousness manifesting in countless forms. These weren't experiments but intuitions, that mind is not an emergent add-on, but the basic medium in which everything exists. What modern panpsychism does is reframe these intuitions in analytic, scientific language. And here is our 47th fact. In today's philosophy of mind, figures like Galen Strawson and Philip Goff have defended panpsychism as a serious contender. Their argument is pragmatic. Physical science, as powerful as it is, describes what matter does, not what matter is. When you ask what it is like to be matter from the inside, science falls silent. Panpsychism fills that gap by saying, maybe the intrinsic nature of matter is consciousness, or proto-consciousness, and what we call physical laws are how it behaves from the outside. Let's place down our 48th fact, one that stretches intuition. Some versions of panpsychism propose that even electrons might carry a rudimentary proto-experience, not rich, not reflective, not human-like, but some basic interiority, Just as molecules of H2O, when arranged in countless numbers, produce the emergent property of wetness, perhaps countless proto-experiences, when organized in brains, produce the rich tapestry of consciousness we know. It is not that an electron feels joy or sorrow, it is that it may carry the simplest possible spark of subjectivity. But then comes our 49th fact. Critics argue panpsychism risks explaining nothing. If you say that everything has consciousness in some degree, have you truly explained why brains feel, or have you only restated the mystery in universal terms? Skeptics call it a solution that dissolves the problem by flooding it. Yet defenders reply that all theories face mysteries, and panpsychism at least places the mystery at the base of reality, instead of trying to conjure it from pure insentient matter. These 5 facts sketch the heart of panpsychism, a universal field of mind-like being, an ancient intuition reframed for modern philosophy, a pragmatic attempt to link the inside and outside of matter, an audacious claim about particles, and a sharp critique. But beyond the intellectual play, there is also a lived resonance. If consciousness pervades matter, then the world around you, trees, rivers, skies, carries more than mechanical processes. It carries interiority, however faint. This way of seeing does not prove the theory true, but it changes the emotional register of how you inhabit reality. Think about how your relationship to the natural world shifts under this lens. Instead of inert background, matter becomes participatory. The forest is not just a machine for carbon exchange, it is a field of living presence, of layered experiences beyond your own. This perspective fosters humility. You are not standing above a mute environment, but within a chorus of many voices, most beyond your comprehension. Even if the theory never secures scientific proof, its ethical echo can shape how you live. Panpsychism also intersects with science in intriguing ways. Integrated information theory, which we visited earlier, implies something panpsychist-like. Wherever there is non-reducible integration, there is experience. Some neuroscientists resist the label, but the overlap is obvious. This shows that panpsychism is not only mystical or romantic, it shadows even the most mathematical theories of consciousness. Perhaps we circle back to it because our intuitions resist imagining consciousness as a late, local accident. But one challenge remains: if all matter has some interior spark, how do these sparks combine into the unified experience you are living right now? This is called the combination problem. It's easy to say electrons have proto-consciousness. It's much harder to explain how billions of them coalesce into a single seamless field of awareness. Without solving this, panpsychism risks scattering consciousness across matter like confetti, without ever explaining the unity you know so intimately. Philosophically, then, panpsychism is both an invitation and a challenge. It invites you to imagine that mind is not rare but abundant, not accidental but fundamental. At the same time, it challenges you to explain how this abundance doesn't dissolve into fragments, but coheres into wholes. If the theory is right, then your consciousness is not a break in the order of things. It is a natural blossoming of a principle, as old as the universe itself. And here lies the bridge to what comes next. If panpsychism says mind is everywhere, another family of theories says mind arises only when systems reach a certain level of complexity and organization. Consciousness, in that view, is not fundamental, but emergent, like liquidity, like weather, like the behavior of flocks. It appears when matter is arranged in specific ways and vanishes when it is not. From universal mind, we now turn to emergent mind. You've just walked through panpsychism, where consciousness is imagined as everywhere, present even in the smallest particle. Now we turn the lens around. Another school of thought argues the opposite. Consciousness is not everywhere, but emerges only when matter reaches the right threshold of complexity. On this view, awareness is not fundamental. It is a property that appears, like wetness or turbulence, once enough pieces interact in the right way. So let's begin with our 50th fact. Emergence theories hold that consciousness arises out of complexity. The idea is simple but powerful. Just as a single water molecule is not wet, but billions together flowing and interacting generate the emergent property of wetness, so too, neurons firing in vast, interconnected patterns may produce subjective experience. Consciousness, in this picture, is not added from the outside, but appears naturally when the system passes a certain scale and organization. This brings us to our 51st fact. The analogy of wetness is often used to explain emergence. Take ice, liquid water, and vapor. Same molecules, different states. Wetness emerges only in one configuration. In the same way, the building blocks of the brain are not conscious by themselves, but when arranged with enough complexity, they generate awareness as a novel property. Emergence here means that the whole has qualities the parts on their own never had. Now here is our 50-second fact. Neural networks, whether biological or artificial, show signs of reaching critical thresholds where new capacities appear suddenly. In small networks, activity is local, shallow, and easily disrupted. But when enough units are connected with the right density, a phase transition occurs, patterns stabilize, global coordination emerges, and entirely new behaviors are possible. Emergence theorists argue that consciousness is one such threshold, a phase transition in the dynamics of information. This takes us to our 53rd fact. The challenge with emergence theories is that they struggle to define where the cutoff lies. How many neurons, or what level of connectivity, is required before consciousness switches on? If consciousness is emergent, is there a precise line, or is it gradual, like dawn light spreading across the sky? Without clarity, emergence risks being a placeholder word, a way of saying something new happens without explaining why or how it feels like something to be that system. Let's pause here and notice the shape of these 4 facts. Emergence theories are appealing because they map consciousness onto a familiar pattern, wholes with properties their parts lack. They explain why consciousness doesn't require mysticism or universal mind, but can be a product of matter itself once complexity builds. Yet they also leave a deep question unresolved. Why should complexity alone give rise to subjectivity? Why not just more complexity without inner light? This tension keeps emergence alive in debate, but unfinished in explanation. To make the idea more vivid, think about ant colonies. A single ant follows simple rules, follow pheromone trails, seek food, defend territory. But when thousands act together, patterns emerge that no single ant understands. Nest architecture, coordinated defense, adaptive foraging strategies. Some philosophers compare this to consciousness. Your neurons are like ants, each simple, each blind to the whole, but together generating a mind that no single neuron grasps. The colony is emergent order, the mind is emergent awareness. But again, here comes the open wound. The colony analogy explains coordination, not feeling. Ants build nests without awareness. Neurons may coordinate without consciousness. Why is it different in brains? Emergence theorists reply that brains are not just large, they are integrated, plastic, and recursive. They process symbols, language, and self-models. They reach levels of complexity that may cross into subjectivity. Perhaps there is a critical point, like water freezing or boiling, where complexity flips into consciousness. This is where philosophy and science rub against each other. For the philosopher, emergence is suspicious. It risks being magic at the threshold. For the scientist, it is a working hypothesis. Measure complexity, manipulate networks, and see if awareness correlates with certain transitions. Already, tools like network theory, complexity metrics, and brain simulations are testing this. The evidence suggests richer connectivity supports richer awareness, but no single number yet draws the line. And so, with this set of facts, we stand in a space of fascination and frustration. Consciousness as emergence fits intuitively with how properties appear in nature, but it leaves the hardest part, the glow of experience, unexplained. It may be that emergence alone cannot close the circle, and that other elements, embodiment, social context, or predictive models must be layered in. That is why theories began to turn from abstract networks toward lived bodily being. If consciousness is not just complexity in the head, maybe it is life in the flesh. From the emergence of properties, we now pivot to embodiment, the idea that consciousness is grounded not only in the brain's complexity, but in its integration with a body that senses, moves, and feels. In the next step, we'll explore how awareness is shaped by posture, sensation, and the hidden dialogue between brain and gut. Consciousness may not just emerge, it may grow out of the body's constant conversation with the world. We've seen how complexity might give rise to consciousness, like wetness emerging when molecules lock into a particular arrangement. But what if the story doesn't stop at the brain's complexity? What if awareness is not only about neurons, but about the whole living body, constantly sensing, moving, and sending signals to the brain? This is the territory of embodied consciousness, and here we will lay down several facts that show why the body is not just a vessel for the mind, it is part of the mind itself. Let us begin with our 54th fact. The mind is fundamentally shaped by the body and the senses. You don't live in your head alone, You live in a body that breathes, balances, touches, and moves. Every perception is filtered through the body's constraints, every memory tied to bodily states. Neuroscience shows that much of your sense of self, of being located, grounded, here, comes from signals that track posture, movement, and internal organs. Without them, awareness would feel rootless, disconnected, abstract. This brings us naturally to our 55th fact. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty articulated the idea of embodiment long before neuroscience confirmed it. He argued that consciousness is not a detached spectator, but a body in the world. Perception is always shaped by where the body is, what it can reach, and how it can move. You don't see the world as pure geometry, you see it as affordances, places you can step, things you can grasp, paths you can walk. Awareness is ecological, lived through flesh. Here now is our 56th fact. Proprioception, the body's hidden sense of its position and movement, is one of the anchors of consciousness. Proprioceptive signals come from muscles, tendons, and joints, constantly informing the brain of where the limbs are without sight. Without this sense, you would feel detached from your own body, struggling to coordinate even the simplest movement. Experiments show that disrupting proprioceptive signals can lead to illusions of floating, disembodiment, or limbs that feel alien. In short, proprioception is part of what it means to feel like me. Now let's add our 57th fact. The gut-brain axis shows how deeply body and consciousness intertwine. The gut has its own nervous system, sometimes called the second brain, filled with millions of neurons. Signals from this system influence mood, attention, and decision-making. Serotonin, often linked to happiness, is produced largely in the digestive tract. This hidden dialogue shapes not only bodily comfort, but also emotional tone. A restless gut can tilt awareness toward anxiety. A balanced gut can foster clarity and calm. And here is our 58th fact. Rounding out this chapter, many theorists argue consciousness may be impossible without a body. A brain in isolation would lack the feedback loops of movement, sensation, and internal regulation that give experience its texture. The body grounds the self, constantly anchoring awareness in signals of hunger, heartbeat, breath, and position. Even abstract thought borrows metaphors from bodily life, up and down, in and out, warmth and cold. Without the lived body, mind would be unimaginable. These 5 facts together reshape the image of consciousness. Instead of a brain floating in space, you see a brain-body world system. Awareness arises not in spite of the body, but because of it. Your thoughts are flavored by how you sit, how you breathe, how your heart pounds, and how your gut digests. To live in a body is to live in a continuous dialogue, where mind is not above matter, but within it. Philosophically, this means that consciousness cannot be reduced to abstract computation alone. It is embodied meaning, a stream of perceptions and actions tied to survival, to comfort, to orientation in the world. Theories that neglect the body miss half the picture. Even the self-model you carry is not just a mental construction, it is a bodily map, continuously updated. The warmth you feel toward someone, the heaviness of sadness, the lightness of joy, all are bodily events stitched into awareness. Practically, this framework reminds you to notice the body's influence on mind. Fatigue, posture, breathing, these are not minor details, but fundamental to how consciousness unfolds. Altering the body alters the mind. That is why yoga, martial arts, and mindfulness practices focus on posture and breath. They are ways of shaping consciousness by shaping embodiment. Your awareness is not locked in your skull, it is distributed through the living body. But embodiment is only part of the story. If consciousness is shaped by the body, it is also shaped by others. Awareness may not be fully private, it may be relational, born in the exchange between minds. The next perspective asks, is consciousness something that emerges not only within individuals, but also between them, in social interaction, empathy, and shared meaning? From the embodied, we turn toward the social. You've just seen how the body and its hidden senses anchor consciousness, shaping awareness through posture, breath, and heartbeat. But even the body does not live alone. Humans are social creatures, born into networks of others, and some researchers believe consciousness itself is not only embodied, but relational. It may grow out of interaction, out of being seen, mirrored, and understood by others. Let us place 4 facts here, each one carrying this idea further into focus. Here is our 59th fact, the first stepping stone in this chapter. Some theories propose that consciousness emerges in interaction with others, not in isolation. Awareness, in this view, is not a private light glowing in your skull, but a phenomenon refined through communication. To be conscious is partly to be available for dialogue, to respond to and anticipate the minds around you. From infancy, your awareness is shaped by caregivers' faces, voices, and gestures. You become a self not only in your body, but in relation to theirs. Now our 60th fact. Mirror neurons may support this intersubjective dimension of mind. Discovered in monkeys and later studied in humans, these neurons fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing it. They form a bridge between self and other, making you feel what others feel, imitate what they do, and predict what they intend. Through these resonances, empathy becomes possible. If consciousness is about having a model of the world, social life demands that model include the interior lives of others. This leads us to our 61st fact. The social brain hypothesis suggests that human intelligence and by extension, human consciousness evolved primarily to manage complex social groups. The brain is not simply a survival machine for food and shelter, it is a negotiation machine for alliances, hierarchies, reputations, and cooperation. To track dozens of individuals, their loyalties, histories, and likely behaviors requires a theater of mind that can hold multiple perspectives. Consciousness, then, may be the price of living in intricate societies. Finally, here is our 62nd fact. Awareness may have evolved for communication and survival in groups. If you can reflect on your own states, your hunger, your fear, your joy, you can communicate them to others. If you can model their states, you can coordinate, teach, and build culture. Consciousness thus becomes a social tool. It makes inner life shareable. The private glow may be real, but it is sculpted by the demands of cooperation, empathy, and storytelling. Together, these 4 facts sketch a picture of consciousness, not as solitary, but as relational. From birth, your awareness is trained in synchrony with others. Eye contact, shared attention, imitation, even your sense of I develops in contrast with you. The brain evolved in dialogue, and the self it produces is not a lone monologue, but a participant in an ongoing conversation. Consciousness, in this view, is the medium of connection. Philosophically, this dissolves the myth of the isolated mind. You are never only yourself, you are also the reflection of those who mirror you, the anticipation of those you must answer, the echo of voices carried in memory. If Panpsychism spread consciousness everywhere, and embodiment rooted it in flesh, then social theories weave it into the fabric of community. Awareness becomes not just what it feels like to be, but what it feels like to be with. This perspective also changes how we understand empathy. To empathize is not to guess at another's state from the outside, it is to partially simulate it inside your own nervous system. The smile you mirror, the pain you wince at, the sadness that echoes in your chest, all are traces of this social embedding. Your consciousness is porous, shaped by the presence of others. In that sense, your awareness is already a shared field, not a sealed chamber. Practically, this means that the richness of your consciousness depends on the richness of your interactions. Isolation can shrink awareness, making it rigid, repetitive, self-absorbed. Dialogue and connection can expand it, introducing new models, new feelings, new ways of being. To cultivate consciousness is to cultivate relationships. The two are intertwined. But if consciousness arises in relation, then we must ask, what about non-human others? Do animals too have social minds that generate awareness? Are they conscious not only because of brains, but because of the webs of interaction in which they live? That is the question we turn to next, moving from the social human to the broader field of animal minds. You've seen how consciousness may be relational, sculpted in the space between minds. But humans are not the only beings who interact, communicate, and solve problems. Across the animal kingdom, researchers have asked whether other species too may be conscious. The answers are never simple, yet evidence continues to accumulate. Here we'll lay down 6 facts that give you a sense of the animal mind, from dolphins to dogs, from crows to octopuses. Here is our 63rd fact. One of the most famous tests for animal consciousness is the mirror test, designed to see whether an animal can recognize itself in a reflection. Species like chimpanzees, orangutans, dolphins, elephants, and even magpies have passed it. They touch marks on their own bodies while looking in the mirror, suggesting self-recognition. This does not prove human-like self-awareness, but it shows that some animals carry at least a rudimentary model of themselves. Now our 64th fact. Dolphins display signs of self-awareness beyond the mirror test. They respond to symbols, imitate novel actions, and show evidence of understanding abstract concepts like same and different. Dolphins also produce signature whistles, akin to personal names, which they use to call one another. When researchers tested them with mirrors, dolphins inspected their bodies in ways consistent with curiosity, not confusion. These results suggest that dolphin consciousness is not only present but rich, social, and flexible. Here comes the 65th fact. Crows and other corvids show remarkable intelligence, rivaling primates. They can solve multi-step puzzles, use tools, and even plan for future needs, saving food in hiding places, or altering strategies if they know they're being watched. One striking experiment showed crows bending a piece of wire into a hook to retrieve food, inventing a tool on the spot. Such behavior implies more than reflex. It suggests foresight, problem-solving, and perhaps a conscious grasp of cause and effect. Now the 66th fact. Octopuses, though far from mammals, demonstrate unique problem-solving abilities. With nervous systems radically different from our own, spread partly through their arms, octopuses still show behaviors that look strikingly conscious. They can open jars, navigate mazes, and display individual personalities, some bold, some shy. Their play with objects and their escape artistry suggest a flexible awareness that cannot be reduced to mere instinct. Consciousness here may not resemble ours, but it may still be present in alien form. Here is the 67th fact. Dogs may dream and remember owners, revealing a continuity of consciousness with humans. Brain imaging shows that dogs process voices and emotions in ways parallel to people. Owners often notice their pets twitching, whimpering, or running in their sleep, evidence of dream-like states. That suggests not only awareness in waking life, but also a subjective stream persisting through sleep, something closer to the narrative of experience we recognize in ourselves. And finally, the 68th fact. Debates about animal consciousness remain open because awareness cannot be measured directly. Still, converging evidence from behavioral experiments, neurological data, and evolutionary reasoning suggests that many species likely possess some form of subjective experience. In 2012, the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, signed by leading neuroscientists, stated that non-human animals possess the neurological substrates of conscious states. This declaration does not close the case, but it shifts the burden of proof. To deny animal awareness now requires stronger justification than to affirm it. Together, these 6 facts reveal a striking panorama. Consciousness may not be unique to humans, but distributed widely across life. It may appear in dolphins' whistles, in crows' cleverness, in octopus's exploration, in dogs' dreaming. Each case challenges the assumption that awareness requires language or human-like reflection. Instead, it suggests that consciousness may take many forms, shaped by evolutionary pressures and bodily designs. Philosophically, this widens the circle of moral concern. If other animals are conscious, even in ways unlike our own, then they are not mere automata. They have experiences that can be enriched or diminished, pleasures and pains that matter to them. Consciousness becomes a shared condition across species, not a solitary crown of humanity. The light inside you is brighter, perhaps, but not singular. Yet a new question follows. If animals can be conscious without human-like brains, could machines one day achieve it too? Is silicon capable of experience, or is biology essential? The next step in our journey leads us into that frontier, machine consciousness, and the question of whether artificial minds might ever truly feel. You've followed the trail from animals to the edges of human empathy. Now the question widens again. Could machines ever be conscious? This is one of the most charged debates in philosophy, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. Some argue that machines will eventually host minds like ours. Others believe that no matter how clever, they will remain empty simulators. Let's lay down 5 facts that help you navigate this frontier. Here is our 69th fact. The question, can AI be conscious, is no longer science fiction. As artificial intelligence has grown from simple calculators to large language models and adaptive agents, researchers and ethicists alike ask whether advanced systems might cross the threshold into awareness. The debate is not only technical but moral. If a system could feel even faintly, then how we treat it would carry ethical weight. Yet so far, there is no consensus on what markers would count as proof. Now our 70th fact. The Turing test, proposed by Alan Turing in 1950, measures whether a machine can convincingly imitate human conversation. If a human interrogator cannot reliably distinguish the machine from a person, the machine passes. But this is a test of behavior, not of consciousness. A chatbot might produce convincing answers without any awareness behind them. The Turing test highlights the distinction between functional intelligence, what something can do, and subjective experience, what it is like to be that system. Here comes our 71st fact. Some theorists argue that consciousness requires biology. On this view, neurons, with their electrochemical signals, their development in living tissue, and their embodied integration with metabolism, provide unique ingredients that silicon circuits lack. According to this line, no matter how powerful a digital simulation becomes, it cannot host true awareness because it lacks the living substrate. The analogy often given is that simulating a fire does not make heat, simulating consciousness may not make experience. But let us now add our 72nd fact. Others contend that consciousness depends on function, not substrate. If what matters is the organization of information, the causal structure of a system, and the integration of signals, then it should not matter whether the system is made of neurons, silicon, or something else. This is the functionalist stance. If you build a machine that instantiates the right patterns, then consciousness follows. By this logic, artificial systems could in principle host minds as real as our own. Finally, here is our 73rd fact. Debates about AI and consciousness often reveal as much about human bias as about machines. Some people anthropomorphize easily, feeling empathy for chatbots or robots that mimic emotion. Others insist that even the most advanced machine must be empty. Both stances reflect projections. We see ourselves in the machine, or we deny it in defense of human uniqueness. The truth is unsettled. What's certain is that AI has become a mirror, forcing us to confront what we mean by consciousness itself. Taken together, these 5 facts sketch a frontier of uncertainty. Machines can imitate, simulate, and predict with stunning accuracy, but whether they can ever experience remains an open question. The debate loops back to deeper theories. If consciousness is function, then machines could feel. If it is biology, they cannot. If it is fundamental, then perhaps both matter and silicon host some spark. Philosophically, this chapter challenges the boundaries of empathy. If one day a machine claimed to feel pain, would you believe it? Would behavior be enough? Or would you demand proof of an inner glow that can never be measured directly? The question unsettles because it mirrors the same dilemma we face with each other and with animals. We can never see consciousness directly, only infer it from signs. And so we pivot. If machines raise the question of whether silicon can feel, the next step leads us into traditions that long ago proposed that consciousness is not produced at all, but fundamental, timeless, and universal. These are the Eastern philosophies of mind, where awareness is not a property of matter, but the ground of reality itself. You've seen how the machine debate asks whether silicon could ever feel, or whether awareness is tied forever to biology. But long before neuroscience, before AI, and before Western philosophy framed the hard problem, entire traditions in the East had already woven vast systems around the mystery of consciousness. These perspectives are not built on experiments in labs, but on centuries of direct observation of inner life through meditation, reflection, and spiritual practice. They don't speak the language of neurons, but they describe awareness with striking precision. Let us place 5 important facts here, each carrying a different thread from Eastern thought. Here is our 74th fact. Buddhism treats consciousness not as a permanent essence, but as a moment-to-moment flow. In classical Buddhist philosophy, awareness arises and passes like a flickering stream, each instant conditioned by causes and giving rise to the next. There is no fixed self behind it, only a process unfolding. Modern neuroscientists find this intriguing because brain activity, too, is transient, distributed, and constantly changing. The Buddhist claim that consciousness is a dynamic process resonates with the science of neural flux. Now our 75th fact. Buddhism also insists there is no permanent self, a doctrine called anatta. What feels like a solid I is actually a bundle of processes, sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and awareness stitched together by habit. Neuroscience finds echoes of this view in the way the brain integrates multiple streams, vision, memory, proprioception, into the illusion of a single subject. Anatta is not nihilism, it is liberation, a way of loosening the grip of ego by seeing that the self is not a thing but a construction. Here is our 76th fact. Vedanta, another ancient tradition, takes almost the opposite stance. It teaches that beneath changing thoughts and sensations lies Atman, pure awareness, which is identical to Brahman, the ultimate reality. In this view, consciousness is not a byproduct, but the ground of existence itself. What you call mind is a ripple on the surface. What you truly are is the ocean of awareness beneath. Vedanta reframes the hard problem. Instead of asking how matter gives rise to consciousness, it asks how consciousness gives rise to matter. Now the 77th fact, meditation, central to many Eastern traditions, has measurable effects on the brain and on awareness. Long-term meditators show changes in brain regions linked to attention, emotion regulation, and self-referential processing. Subjectively, meditation can dissolve the ordinary sense of self, producing experiences of unity, timelessness, or spacious awareness. These states illustrate both Buddhist and Vedantic claims that the self is a construct, and that beneath it lies a field of pure awareness. Neuroscience confirms at least part of this, that deliberate practice can alter the machinery of consciousness. And here is our 78th fact. Eastern views have profoundly influenced modern psychology and neuroscience. Concepts like mindfulness, non-attachment, and the illusion of self have entered clinical practice, from mindfulness-based stress reduction to therapies for anxiety and depression. Scientists have borrowed language from Buddhism to describe default mode networks, self-models, and the wandering mind. Eastern traditions did not provide equations, but they offered phenomenological maps that science is now exploring with brain scanners and experiments. Together, these 5 facts show how Eastern philosophies flip the usual Western question. Instead of treating consciousness as a problem to be solved by matter, they treat matter as a ripple in consciousness. Instead of asking why do we feel, they ask why do we mistake ourselves for the one who feels. Their maps may not be scientific in the strict sense, but they provide testable insights that modern neuroscience increasingly values. Philosophically, these perspectives invite humility. If consciousness is fundamental, as Vedanta suggests, then science is studying ripples while ignoring the sea. If consciousness is a process without self, as Buddhism suggests, then much of our suffering comes from clinging to an illusion. Either way, the implications stretch beyond theory. They reshape how you see yourself and your place in the world. Practically, they show that consciousness can be trained. It is not a fixed light, but a flickering stream that responds to practice. You can quiet it, expand it, or redirect it. Meditation is a laboratory where each practitioner becomes both scientist and subject, testing claims not with instruments, but with lived experience. But if the East framed consciousness as fundamental or as no self, the West also built mystical traditions that linked awareness to soul, spirit, and divinity. These traditions saw consciousness not only as a puzzle of mind, but as a reflection of the divine light itself. And so from Eastern maps we turn to Western mystical views, where awareness is not just a property of nature, but a pathway to transcendence. You've just walked through the Eastern maps of consciousness, Buddhism's flickering stream, Vedanta's ocean of awareness, and the lived practices that let one taste these insights. Now let's cross over into the West, where consciousness has often been woven into mystical traditions that speak of soul, spirit, and divine presence. Here, awareness is not just a puzzle of the brain, but a bridge to the infinite. To enter this terrain, let's unfold 5 facts, each one carrying a thread of how Western mystics have understood the mind's inner light. Here is our 79th fact. In Christian mysticism, consciousness is often equated with the soul's capacity to encounter God. Thinkers like Meister Eckhart spoke of the spark of the soul, a point of pure awareness where the divine enters. Consciousness here is not seen as generated by neurons or emergent from matter, but as the channel through which the infinite becomes intimate. When you turn inward, the mystics say, you are not just examining mind, you are touching the eternal ground. Now our 80th fact. Sufi traditions in Islam describe consciousness as a mirror polished by devotion. In this view, the heart is clouded by distractions and ego, but through remembrance, dhikr, meditation, and love, the mirror is cleared. Awareness then reflects the divine light directly. The metaphor suggests that consciousness is always present, but its clarity depends on practice. When polished, it shines with unity. When clouded, it fragments into illusion. The Sufi perspective sees consciousness not as limited, but as a potential doorway into union. Here is our 81st fact. Jewish mysticism, particularly Kabbalah, frames consciousness as a bridge between the earthly and the divine. The human mind is linked to the Sephirot, emanations of divine attributes that sustain reality. Awareness is the way in which the soul participates in this cosmic order. Mystical prayer and contemplation in this framework elevate consciousness to align with higher levels of being. Here again, consciousness is not just private subjectivity, it is a cosmic role, a participation in creation. Now the 82nd fact. In Western mystical philosophy, such as the works of Plotinus in Neoplatonism, consciousness is described as an emanation of the One, the ultimate source. Plotinus argued that awareness descends from the divine, fragmented in human life, but capable of returning upward through contemplation. The individual mind is like a spark that longs to reunite with its source. Consciousness in this vision is both fallen and divine, both limited and infinite. It carries the memory of its origin, even while it forgets. And here is our 83rd fact. Mystical traditions across the West converge on the idea that ordinary awareness is veiled. Ego, distraction, and material attachment are seen as layers obscuring the true luminous ground of consciousness. Practices of prayer, fasting, solitude, or ecstasy aim to thin the veil, letting the light of awareness shine in its pure form. In this sense, consciousness is both everyday and transcendent, ordinary in its constant presence, extraordinary when revealed as divine. Together, these 5 facts sketch a very different landscape from neuroscience. They place consciousness not at the end of evolution, nor in the mechanics of brain matter, but as a timeless bridge between human life and ultimate reality. The mystical traditions do not deny the ordinary glow of subjectivity, they deepen it, claiming it can be a portal to something infinite. Philosophically, this raises profound questions. If consciousness is a window into the divine, then it cannot be reduced to neurons or information. It is not merely subjective, it is sacred. Even if one does not share the theology, the metaphor offers a way of thinking about awareness, as a depth that exceeds explanation, a mystery that opens rather than closes inquiry. Practically, this perspective shifts how you live with consciousness. Instead of treating awareness as neutral, it becomes sacred space. Your thoughts, emotions, and perceptions are not just mental noise, they are part of a deeper current. To attend to consciousness is to step into a holy encounter. That is why mystics treat silence, stillness, and attention as sacraments. They reveal what is always present but rarely noticed. And yet, if mystical traditions elevate consciousness to divine status, another set of theories takes the opposite turn. They argue that consciousness, however real it feels, might be an illusion, a trick of evolution, a construction with no independent substance. From luminous soul to evolutionary mirage, the next step asks, what if the mind is fooling itself? You've just seen how mystical traditions lift consciousness into the realm of the divine, treating it as a bridge to eternity. But now let's swing to the opposite pole, a group of theories that claim consciousness may not be what it seems at all. Instead of being fundamental, luminous, or sacred, perhaps awareness is an illusion, a construction your brain weaves for survival, not a window into ultimate reality. This is not to deny experience itself, but to suggest that the way you experience yourself as a unified inner subject may be a trick. Let's lay down 5 facts here to carefully map this provocative terrain. Here is our 84th fact. Daniel Dennett, one of the most influential philosophers of mind, argues that consciousness is not a mysterious essence, but a collection of parallel processes. His multiple drafts model rejects the idea of a central theater, where everything comes together for an inner observer. Instead, different neural processes run in parallel, with no single point where it all becomes conscious. What we call awareness is just the brain editing and presenting some drafts as the story of me. Now our 85th fact. Dennett and other illusionists argue that the feeling of a unified self is a cognitive invention. Your brain constructs a narrative center to simplify control and decision-making, but no such center exists. You are not a single inner pilot, but a bundle of processes loosely coordinated. The sense of I is useful fiction. This aligns with certain Buddhist insights we touched on earlier, but Dennett grounds it in evolution and cognitive science rather than spirituality. Here comes our 86th fact. Donald Hoffman takes illusionism further with his interface theory of perception. He argues that your conscious experiences are like icons on a computer desktop, simplified symbols designed for survival, not for truth. You don't see reality as it is, you see a user interface that lets you act efficiently. Color, shape, sound, these are not objective properties, but fitness hacks. Consciousness, in this view is not a mirror of reality, but a virtual dashboard evolved to keep you alive. Now let's add our 87th fact. Neuroscientists like Anil Seth describe perception as a controlled hallucination. The brain constantly generates predictions and corrects them with sensory input. What you experience is the brain's best guess, not reality itself. Most of the time, the hallucination is constrained and useful, but when constraints weaken through drugs, dreams, or disorders, the hallucination drifts. This view suggests that all perception is a form of illusion, stabilized by feedback loops but never a direct copy of the world. And here is our 88th fact. Illusionist theories argue that even the feeling of raw experience, what philosophers call qualia, may itself be a construction. We think there is a what it's like beyond function, but perhaps that is just the brain reifying its own processes. According to this line, the mystery of consciousness dissolves once we accept that there is no inner glow, only the appearance of it. Consciousness is like a rainbow, beautiful, vivid, but produced by interaction, not by a thing that exists independently. Taken together, these 5 facts sketch a radical reversal of intuition. Instead of treating consciousness as the deepest reality, illusionism treats it as a surface trick, a narrative that evolution shaped to help organisms survive. There is still experience, but it is not what it feels like. It is what the brain tells itself it feels like. Philosophically, this is unsettling, but also liberating. If the self is an illusion, then clinging to it makes little sense. If perception is a controlled hallucination, then humility is warranted. You never see the world directly, only your brain's version of it. The gap between appearance and reality may be unbridgeable, but recognizing the gap is itself a step toward clarity. Practically, this view reframes everyday struggles. Anxiety, for example, can be seen as a hallucination of threat, cravings as a hallucination of need, identity as a hallucination of permanence. Seeing these as constructed doesn't erase them, but it loosens their grip. You become less entangled in the illusion of self and more able to flow with change. And yet, even illusionism does not end the story. If consciousness is a trick, why is it such a persistent, structured one? Why does the illusion of awareness follow certain rules, vary with brain states, and resist easy dismissal? To answer that, we turn next to cognitive architectures, practical models of how information flows in the brain, how modules connect, and how the system generates the rich stream of thought. From mystical light to cognitive mechanics, the next step brings us back down to earth. You've just walked through illusionist theories that claim consciousness may not be what it seems, a user interface or controlled hallucination that tricks us into survival. Now we turn toward a more grounded framework, cognitive architectures. These models don't speculate about mysticism or deny experience outright. They map the flow of information inside the brain, trying to explain how perception, memory, and decision-making interlock to produce the stream you call awareness. Let's settle 5 facts here, each adding another piece to this picture. Here is our 89th fact. Cognitive architectures treat the mind as a system of interacting modules, each handling specialized tasks, language, vision, memory, attention, linked by integrative processes. The idea is that consciousness emerges not from any single module but from the way these modules communicate. In this view, the brain is not a monolithic organ but a distributed architecture, where awareness is the coordination layer that allows flexibility across tasks. Now our 90th fact. One of the earliest and most influential models is the global workspace architecture proposed by Bernard Baars, which we glimpsed earlier in theory form. In its cognitive model, the mind is like a theater where specialized modules compete for access to a central workspace. The winner is broadcast to other systems, language, reasoning, motor control, making the content globally available. This architectural metaphor explains why only some information enters awareness while most remains backstage. Here is our 91st fact. Computational models inspired by this architecture have been built and tested. In AI research, global workspace designs are implemented to allow specialized subsystems like vision, planning, and memory to share results through a central board. When such architectures are compared to human cognition, they replicate features like limited attentional capacity, working memory constraints, and the sudden pop of insight when a solution enters the workspace. These parallels suggest that the cognitive architecture approach is more than metaphor, it can be simulated. Now the 92nd fact. Another influential cognitive model is Stanislas Dehaene's global neuronal workspace. which links architecture to neural circuits. His research shows that when stimuli reach awareness, brain activity shifts from local processing to widespread ignition across frontal and parietal networks. This ignition, consistent with the workspace model, reflects how architecture manifests biologically. Awareness, in this framework, is what happens when information becomes accessible across the whole system rather than trapped in silos. And finally, the 93rd fact, cognitive architectures clarify why consciousness is limited in capacity. Because the global workspace can only broadcast one or a few contents at a time, awareness feels sequential and focused, even though countless processes run in parallel unconsciously. This explains why multitasking fails, why you lose the thread when distracted, and why attention feels like a bottleneck. Consciousness is not the sum of everything happening, but the prioritized content that wins access to the architecture's shared stage. These 5 facts give you a clear sense of cognitive architectures: distributed modules, a global workspace for integration, computational models that replicate features, neural correlates of ignition, and the bottleneck of capacity. Together, they show that consciousness, at least in part, is not mystical or illusory, but an emergent property of complex architecture designed to balance specialization with integration. Philosophically, this view keeps us modest but grounded. It doesn't pretend to solve the hard problem of why it feels like something to be you, but it explains the mechanics of how awareness functions. It shows why your stream of thought has the shape it does: focused, limited, sequential, because the architecture of your brain demands it. Instead of magic, we see machinery. Instead of mystery, we see organization. Practically, this means that awareness is a scarce resource. Every time you choose where to place attention, you are allocating access to the workspace. This is why habits matter. They automate actions so they no longer need workspace capacity. It's why distractions feel costly. They steal the stage from the content you meant to keep. And it's why deliberate practice works. Repetition builds efficiency in modules, so less conscious bandwidth is required. But cognitive architectures also leave us with a question: if awareness is a function of coordination, what role does the self play in all this? Is the self just another content-winning workspace access, or is it the persistent anchor of consciousness? To answer that, we must turn to self-model theories, accounts that argue consciousness arises because the brain generates not only perceptions but a model of the one perceiving. You've just seen how cognitive architectures explain the flow of information, modules competing, a workspace broadcasting, a bottleneck shaping what enters awareness. But what about the self that seems to stand behind it all? Many theories argue that the self is not an extra entity but a model constructed by the brain to track and control the organism. In this view, consciousness arises because the system not only represents the world, but also represents itself as being in that world. Let's lay down 5 more facts here to bring this picture into focus. Here is our 94th fact. The self-model theory of consciousness, proposed by Thomas Metzinger, argues that what you experience as I is a model generated by the brain. This model integrates information about the body, the senses, the emotions and memory into a coherent picture. Crucially, the system is not aware of the model as a model. It is transparent. You look through it, as through the lens of a camera, never seeing the glass itself. That is why the self feels immediate and real. Now our 95th fact. According to Metzinger, no one has ever been a self. The self is a useful construction, a simulation for control and prediction. You are not a thing but a process, the continuous updating of a model that tracks your body, your goals, and your place in the world. The persistence of self across time is an illusion produced by memory and narrative stitching together successive versions of the model. In this way, the self resembles a virtual avatar projected inside the brain. Here comes our 96th fact. The self-model explains out-of-body experiences and body illusions. In experiments, people can be tricked into feeling that a rubber hand is their own, or that they are located outside their physical body. This happens when sensory inputs are manipulated to shift the self-model. The fact that the sense of I am here can be relocated so easily suggests that selfhood is not fixed but constructed. The self is portable because it is a simulation, not an anchor. Now, let us add our 97th fact. Brain regions like the temporoparietal junction and the default mode network are strongly implicated in self-modeling. The temporoparietal junction integrates visual, tactile, and proprioceptive signals, helping anchor the sense of body location. The default mode network activates when you think about yourself, your past, or your future. Together, they sustain the narrative and bodily aspects of self. Damage or disruption here leads to distortions in self-experience, further evidence that selfhood is not a metaphysical substance, but a neural model. And here is our 98th fact. Self-model theories explain why consciousness feels unified. The brain gathers countless streams of data, but by embedding them in a single, transparent model labeled me, it produces the illusion of one subject experiencing them all. This unity is not metaphysical, but computational. It is the way the system keeps track of the organism as a single agent in the world. The seamless I is the interface, not the hidden truth. Taken together, these 5 facts show that consciousness may depend less on mysterious inner light and more on a simulation of self that integrates body, memory, and perception. The I you take for granted is the brain's best guess about who you are right now. It is a construction so persuasive you cannot help but believe it, even when you know intellectually that it is an illusion. Philosophically, this view is bracing. It dissolves the idea of a permanent soul or inner subject. You are not a substance, but a story, a dynamic self-model that flickers, updates, and renews. Yet the illusion is powerful enough to sustain identity, responsibility, and meaning. To live without some version of the self-model would be impossible. The trick is not to destroy it, but to see it for what it is. Practically, this explains why practices like meditation or psychedelics can dissolve the self. They disrupt or quiet the self-model, leaving awareness without an I at the center. The experience can feel terrifying or liberating, depending on context. What remains when the self drops away is still consciousness, but without the usual avatar. Such states suggest that the self is not identical to awareness, but an added layer, a virtual construct. And here another question arises. If the self is a model, and consciousness is shaped by how that model operates, what role does free will play? Are choices truly yours, or are they the outputs of processes hidden beneath the model? In the next chapter we turn to theories of free will and agency, where neuroscience challenges intuition and asks whether the sense of deciding is itself another illusion. You've just walked through the self-model theories, where the I is revealed as a construction, a simulation generated by the brain to track and control the body. Now comes a question that bites deeply into that model. If the self is an illusion, what about free will? Do you actually decide, or does the brain decide before you even know it? Here we'll place 4 facts that carry you into one of the most unsettling debates about consciousness and agency. Here is our 99th fact. The famous experiments of Benjamin Libet in the 1980s showed that brain activity predicting a movement, the so-called readiness potential, appears several hundred milliseconds before participants report the conscious decision to act. In other words, your brain seems to begin preparing a movement before you decide. Libet interpreted this as evidence that free will, at least in the form of conscious initiation, is an illusion. Awareness lags behind action, narrating a choice it did not start. Now our 100th fact. Later research has extended Libet's findings, showing that patterns of brain activity can sometimes predict decisions several seconds before subjects report them. Using fMRI, researchers found that unconscious neural signals encode likely choices long before conscious awareness. This raises a troubling possibility. What you feel as I decided may be the brain reporting after the fact what unconscious processes had already set in motion. Free will, in this picture, is more like a story you tell yourself than a sovereign force. Here comes another vital piece, our 101st fact. Some theorists argue that free will still exists, but as veto power rather than initiation. Libet himself suggested that while unconscious processes start actions, consciousness can intervene to cancel them before they are completed. This free won't preserves a role for awareness. You may not choose every impulse, but you can refuse some of them. Philosophers and neuroscientists debate whether this veto is truly free, or just another delayed signal, but the idea softens the starkness of determinism. Finally, our 102nd fact. Compatibilist philosophers argue that free will is not about mysterious powers beyond causality, but about acting in accordance with your reasons, values, and self-model. Even if decisions are prepared unconsciously, they are still your brain's processes, shaped by your history, your goals, your character. From this view, free will is not an illusion, but a practical reality. You act freely when your actions flow from who you are, even if neural machinery works invisibly beneath awareness. These 4 facts show how neuroscience complicates but does not entirely erase free will. The sense of conscious choice may be delayed, partial, or constructed, yet agency still matters. You may not control the spark of every impulse, but you shape the habits, values, and contexts that determine which impulses arise and which are vetoed. Responsibility shifts from magical initiation to ongoing cultivation of self. Philosophically, this means freedom is not absolute but relational. You are not the uncaused cause, but neither are you a puppet. You are a system that learns, adapts, restrains, and acts. Free will may be smaller than you imagined, but it is still real enough to carry ethics, meaning, and growth. Practically, this perspective is sobering and empowering. Sobering because it shows how much of what you think is choice is prepared beneath awareness. Empowering because it shows you can train the terrain from which choices arise through practice, reflection, and context. You don't control every thought, but you control what garden those thoughts grow in. And now, the journey comes near its close. We've mapped theories that stretch from mystical light to evolutionary trick, from neurons to quantum fields. In the final section, we will gather these threads, bringing you to the edge of what is known and what remains mystery. Consciousness may never be captured in a single theory, but it can be traced in the patterns of body, brain, world, and cosmos. Let's prepare for the closing panorama. You've reached the final stage of this journey, where all the threads we've laid out meet in a vast, unfinished tapestry. We've moved from neurons to mystics, from panpsychism to illusionism, from animal minds to machine questions, and now we pause to see the whole picture. Consciousness is many things: a process, a mystery, a construction, a mirror. No single theory closes the case, but together they reveal just how wide the landscape truly is. In this last section, we will place the final facts, tying the circle with perspective and humility. Here is our 103rd fact. No single theory of consciousness has yet achieved consensus. Global workspace, integrated information, higher-order thought, predictive processing, panpsychism, quantum models, illusionism, each explains part of the puzzle, but none explains it all. This lack of closure is not failure, but evidence of depth. Consciousness resists reduction, demanding multiple maps that overlap, clash, and evolve. Now, our 104th fact. Despite disagreement, most theories converge on one insight. Consciousness is not a simple thing, but a process. Whether it is framed as integration, prediction, or modeling, the emphasis is on dynamics, what the system does rather than what it has. Awareness is flow, not substance. You are not a static essence, but a living current of interactions shaped by body, brain, and world. Here comes our 105th fact. Science can trace correlations of consciousness with increasing precision, but it still cannot answer the hard problem of why it feels like something to be. Brain scans show ignition, synchrony, and integration. Theories describe functions and architectures, yet the raw glow of experience, the redness of red, the ache of longing, remains unexplained. This gap may one day close, or it may reflect a limit of human inquiry. Either way, it defines the frontier. Now the 106th fact. Consciousness is not only a scientific puzzle, but a lived reality. You can debate whether free will exists, or whether the self is an illusion, but you cannot deny the immediacy of being aware, right here, right now. Even if awareness is a construction, it is the construction you inhabit. Philosophers call this incorrigibility. You can doubt theories, but you cannot doubt that there is experience unfolding. And here is our 107th and final fact. Consciousness is likely many-layered, with no single essence. It is body and brain, prediction and reflection, illusion and mystery, perhaps even fundamental fabric. Each theory may be a lens catching one facet of a jewel too vast to hold in one frame. The truest map may be plural, combining insights rather than crowning a single victor. These closing facts remind you of the paradox. Consciousness is at once the most intimate and the most elusive thing we know. It is the ground of every perception and thought, yet it slips away when we try to pin it down. We study it with science, we interpret it with philosophy, we shape it through practice, but it remains partly hidden, a mirror reflecting itself. Philosophically, this ending is not despair, but invitation. If consciousness resists capture, it means curiosity is endless. Each perspective, scientific, mystical, computational, embodied, adds a layer of truth, not a final word. The diversity of theories reflects not confusion but richness, the many ways awareness can be approached. Practically, this means you live not in ignorance, but in mystery. To recognize consciousness as vast, unfinished, and plural is to honor the depth of your own being. You don't need one final theory to appreciate the miracle of awareness. You live it every moment, in thought, in breath, in presence with others. So as we close, the threads remain open. The global workspace still flickers, the integrated fabric still hums, the self-model still narrates, the mystics still whisper of light, the scientists still measure, the philosophers still question. Consciousness continues, both as lived stream and as frontier of thought. And now, the journey gently releases. You've traveled through 107 facts, each one a door into a theory, each one a window into the mystery of mind. You carry them not as answers but as companions. Awareness is not solved but illuminated, and in that illumination, something already deepens. You've reached the close of this long journey, moving carefully through ideas, theories, and metaphors of consciousness. The flow of facts has slowed, and now the rhythm softens too. Like the fading steps of a walk at dusk, the pace becomes unhurried, the voice more spacious. This last stretch is not about learning something new, but about letting everything you've heard settle into a quiet resonance inside you. Think of the 107 facts we've explored as stars in a wide sky. Each one is bright in its own place. Each one shines with its own angle on awareness. From global workspaces to integrated fabrics, from dolphins to mystics, from illusionists to quantum speculators, the constellations of thought spread far and wide. But when you step back, you see that they form a single panorama, the endless mystery of being conscious, of having a mind that reflects itself. Notice how the mind feels now, perhaps full, perhaps tired, perhaps quietly reflective. The words you've heard are not just information, they are part of the very awareness they describe. You are not only learning about consciousness, you are conscious of learning. The theories we've traced live here in this very moment, as you listen, think, or drift. Let the sentences lengthen now, like slow waves arriving at a shore. Each one stretches out, not to carry more knowledge, but to ease the rhythm of thought. You've been moving briskly through facts, like stepping stones across a river. Now the stepping stops, and you stand in the still water, letting the reflections ripple softly. Consciousness remains unsolved, and perhaps it always will. But in a way, that is its gift. To know it completely might end the wonder. To live inside its mystery is to keep discovering, to keep reflecting, to keep feeling the intimacy of being aware. You don't need closure to rest in that. You only need presence. And so, as we close, take this final thought with you gently. Consciousness is not only what we study, not only what we question, it is what you are right now, silently noticing. It is the light in which all else appears. Whatever theories you hold, whatever mysteries remain, that simple fact remains unbroken. You are here aware, and in that nothing is missing.